Hi, everybody. Because I'm having you do some work with young adult literature, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that term, as well as maybe how it might vary from how others view it. I should also add, and I'm not sure if I could have another video about this or not, but one of the things to consider as you plan a course is what you want your students to read. And I hope that you are in a school where that is not just decided for you. If you are in a school like that, I encourage you to look for a better school, or at least to advocate for changes, because what students need is going to vary from class to class, from year to year, from school to school. What I like to do in high school, particularly, was to alternate between works of young adult literature and works of classic literature, because I believed and believe both are important. And so, um, when I taught freshmen, I taught Romeo and Juliet usually because it was something that was kind of in the district's curriculum. Um, but then I would teach a work like that, and then the next work I would teach would be a work of young adult literature. So I mentioned, I think, in a response to somebody's discussion query, but so I ended up teaching, like, the first thing I had students read before anything else in class was Sleeping Freshmen Never Lie, which is not like it's not a fabulous book. It's not, and it's not going to win. It didn't win a Newbery or anything like that, or a Prince Award, but it was fun. And it was about high school, and it was someone who had just started high school, and they were just starting high school, and it was a nice way to start the year. We also read, again, Romeo and Juliet. We read the Odyssey. We read classic works and adult works, but I like to alternate those with young adult works. I would often try to go back and forth. We also had a literature anthology, a literature textbook, in other words, and we also used that because students do need to read short stories and, again, and poetry, and that was a helpful collection of both of those things. And so, for example, in there, those works were usually, classic works. They were not written specifically for young people, and that was fine. But I never taught only from the anthology. Whenever, like that, and that was true actually when I taught elementary school too. The elementary schools I taught at were unique in that the grades that I taught, which are fifth and sixth grade, did not use the school's adopted reading textbook. They used novels instead, and they had to fight for that. And I do think that we probably used novels a little too much, and there would have been a better place to use the textbook also, more than we did. Looking back at it with the benefit of experience, but I think it's important. All right. So moving back now to be a little more on topic and what young adult literature is. So there's an interesting article. It's short. I'm going to actually upload it, I think, for next week, by Chris Crow about young adult literature, and he has some very um, strong opinions about it. And that's not unusual in academics. Like, lots of people have strong opinions about things. I certainly have strong opinions about things. But his article is largely negative, I think, complaining about how people call things young adult literature that is not truly young adult literature. And I tend to always be really cautious around people who like to define things and say, well, this isn't really an example of that. And I tend to, this is my personal bias, I tend not to always give them a lot of credence. And I, I think there is, I think there's an issue there. But I think it's important for you to engage in that. I think it is thought provoking. Um, he has taught young adult literature courses in college, and so have his colleagues because he teaches at a large college. Um, and he proudly claims in this article that he doesn't assign anything written before 1965. And the reason he says 1965 is that is when S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders was published. Or sorry, 1967. And The Outsiders is often considered one of the seminal works of young adult literature that really put it on the map as its own genre, as its own thing. But not everybody agrees with that. And the examples given, and he gives these examples too, sort of not liking them, are works like Great Expectations, Little Women, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and Catcher in the Rye. Many people would consider these works of young adult literature. At the high school I taught at, I had a colleague who taught Huck Finn. I would have loved to have taught Catcher in the Rye. I was not able to because it was reserved for seniors, and I didn't teach above juniors in English, so I was never able to teach that. Um, I'm trying to remember if I taught Great Expectations or not, and I don't think I taught Dickens, and I think it might have been A Tale of Two Cities, and it did not go as well as I would have liked it to have gone. But that could entirely be on me, or maybe it just wasn't a good fit for my class. Um, these are works of classic literature that are often taught in high schools. Now, I think Crow hates that idea, both because it's largely because they're old, and he argues they are no longer relevant. Um, and also because these were books that, for the most part, were not written for young people. These were written for adults. They were not written for adolescents. And so, a core question to think about is, does young adult literature have to be written for young adults to be classified as that? There are lots of boundaries as well. There's also boundaries. He complains about this too a little bit with children's literature. There is not a clear dividing line between a work of children's literature and a work of young adult literature. He points out correctly that works like The Giver or Jacob Have I Loved, or The Hero and the Crown, or Dicey's Song, um, all of which were Newbery winners or Newbery honor books from the American Library Association, for children's literature are really young adult literature books, or at least teen readers would not be surprised to pick them up. Like they would not, that would be awesome. But other works that the Newbery has been given to, or the Newbery Honor, are clearly for children, such as Ramona Quimby, age 8, or Frog and Toad Together. And as he points out, the Newbery lists are lists for great literature, which is arguable actually, but they aren't lists for young adult literature, and that's true. They aren't. It works for children, and children is broadly defined. You at times may very well refer to your middle school and high school students as children. I know that I did. And my high school students would get annoyed at times by it, and I would laugh at them and say, then stop acting like children. But I digress. So that's an ongoing question. What is the audience? Because who are young adults? Frankly, nobody agrees. Think about different certification levels for secondary teachers around the country. The grade range varies from state to state, sort of like the default baseline. Oh, I studied secondary English in school. Oh, what grades are you certified to teach? In some states, it's grades 5 through 12, and some it's grades 6 through 12, and some it's grades 7 through 12, and in some it's grades 9 through 12. Think about the broadest range there. There is a huge difference between a 10-year-old who is in 5th grade and a senior in high school. But beyond that, right, there's a big difference between a 12-year-old in 7th grade and an 18-year-old senior. These are individuals who have gone through very different experiences from the time they are 10, 11, 12 till the time they are 16, 17, 18. And those experiences are continuing, don't get me wrong. So a book that an average 11-year-old might absolutely love and would be happy to be seen reading might be really embarrassing for an average 17 or 18-year-old to read. And conversely, a book that would be entirely appropriate for a junior or senior to read might be very inappropriate for a middle school student to read due to its content or for other reasons. You're also going to see some other terms used. Teen fiction has become More popular. I tend to think of that as just sort of the bookstore effect because that is how, large chain bookstores have recently within the past 20 years, started shelving this genre of literature. Um, I personally don't like that phrasing. I don't know why. It kind of bugs me. Um, I suppose it does distinguish between a book for a 12-year-old and a book for a 13-year-old, but again, as we've seen, I think those distinguishing marks really don't exist. Um, for a very long time, it was called adolescent literature. I can't remember if that is still what the name of the course is called at DSU or not, but many colleges, when for a course in young adult literature, call it adolescent literature. That is still widely used, even though it hasn't been used in the scholarship for quite a while. And then the old fashioned term for it is actually juvenile literature. And juvenile literature included both children's and what we might call young adult, what I'm going to call young adult here. But it was. It wasn't really children's literature. Like children's literature was Frog and Toad are friends. Juvenile literature was literature that today would probably be classified as young adult literature. I think of as my example is because I like science fiction is the work of Robert Heinlein from the 1950s. He wrote a lot of classic works of science fiction, some of which have not aged well because of his own political and cultural beliefs, but have really, I would say, engaging plots, interesting characters, and interesting linguistic choices. And he is best known for adult works like Stranger in a Strange Land and Starship Troopers. But he also wrote a series of works for teenagers, essentially, that were widely known as juveniles, like Have Spacesuit, Will Travel. Um, Fun fact, Starship Troopers was originally written for that teenage audience, but was never marketed towards it because it was so incredibly violent. And if you've seen the film Starship Troopers, you have not read the book. They are almost nothing alike, is kind of my understanding. Anyway, so juvenile literature is like the term that was used back in the 50s. Um, Adolescent literature really started, I think, being used more in the 60s, and then young adult literature as a replacement for adolescent because adolescent seemed sort of condescending. Um, that came about really in the 80s, I think, as teens started to have more disposable income. It was a marketing term. All of these are marketing terms. Like let's be real. Some characteristics of it as a genre. It is usually from the viewpoint of a young person, and this is one of the cases where a work for adults like Huckleberry Finn or Little Women, when the protagonist is a young person, is often something that young people relate to. Parental figures, especially biological parents, are usually missing or they are, frankly, kind of incompetent. It really is centered on the young people. Um, they are the ones who take control and who have agency, which is a little bit of wish fulfillment. But think too, I mean, this is true too for some children's literature and beyond, but think, for example, of Charles Schulz's Peanuts comic strips, which, for the most part, um, were adult free. Um, and the very, very few strips where adults were present um, were really, really weird. Like in the 50s or 60s, the character of Lucy Van Pelt was at a golf tournament. And Schultz actually um, drew the adults that were standing around Lucy. Now he never drew their faces; he only drew like their torsos and legs to sort of emphasize how big they were and how small she was. And I believe he said, and I'm not sure. Like I was rereading a few years ago his complete works, and he made it this comment essentially that I think this was a mistake. Either he or the commentator said like this was kind of a mistake. It was he never went back. He never did this again. And one of the things that was not necessarily originally intended, especially in early Peanut strips, you would sometimes read parent voices off stage. Um, that largely went away, right? It was the parents were there; they were still mentioned, sort of, but they were usually missing. They were off stage. It's just like in the animated Peanuts specials, right? When a adult talks, usually a teacher, it's that trademark wah 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 that is no one understands because it's not about the adults. Um, Although this has started to change, there's lots of modern works of young adult literature that are really long. They tended to be shorter works rather than longer works. It is very diverse as a genre. So when we talk about genres of literature, we usually talk about things like realistic fiction, historical fiction, um, what children's literature scholars usually lump together as modern fantasy, what some people call speculative fiction, and what others separate out as fantasy, science fiction, and horror. These are all separate genres, and we can find works of young adult literature, and children's literature in each of those genres. But as an overarching sort of collective genre, I point out is that young adult literature is really diverse because it includes historical fiction and realistic fiction and poetry and nonfiction and so on. And other characteristics that it tends to be optimistic. My children's lit professor when I was in college gave a really good definition of children's lit that I always remember and I always like to share is that no matter what makes children's literature is that there is always a sense of hope. That doesn't mean children's literature can't be very, very sad. Um, Bridge to Terabithia still makes me cry whenever I read it. Like I cannot read that work of children's literature without crying. Um, it doesn't mean that children's literature can't have really dark, serious, important motifs in it. But the theme is always optimistic. The theme is one of hope. The theme is one of resilience. The theme is that, and I know theme should not be it shouldn't be a one word term like hope or resilience. Theme is always, right? It's always something that things will get better, life goes on, things happen for a purpose. We remember people by living our best lives, whatever it might be. There is a sense of hope in children's literature. Young adult literature is often darker than children's literature. It's often more depressing, but it still tends towards optimism in a way that adult literature sometimes doesn't. And then the characters in young adult literature have relatable emotions to their readers. And then I want to end with this idea that I was recently probably reintroduced to about windows and mirrors. And the idea is that literature, and here we're going to talk specifically about young adult literature, but it's true for all literature, ideally gives us, it serves two purposes. It serves multiple purposes, but these are two of them. It serves as mirrors into our own lives. In other words, we want to see ourselves, or at least parts of ourselves, in the characters that we read about. We like to see familiar experiences. And this is why the themes and motifs of young adult literature are familiar. And this is why familiarity is something that I think many readers like. We enjoy that as adult readers often too. Even if we're reading for escapism, we're also looking for things of commonality. But it also provides windows into the experiences of others. So it's both reflective of ourselves, but it should also allow us insight into the experiences and lives of people who are different than we are. Now, because of this, it's important as you consider things like classroom collections or even what texts to teach that you keep both of these things in mind. You want texts that students can see themselves in, but you also want texts that introduce students to the broader world, to other perspectives, to other cultures, and so on. For a long time, there was an overwhelmingly white middle class or upper class protagonists in both children's and young adult literature, and that has started to change. And I know there's still studies that point out that the vast majority of texts are still fall in that. I do think it's much more diverse so than it was. I think it's potentially I think that's a good thing, but I also think sometimes, especially when we teach in communities that maybe are not overly diverse, we still need to have that balance where we want to include those diverse books so students are aware of other people and other cultures and other viewpoints, but we still need to give our students mirrors onto their own lives. So if I am teaching in rural North Dakota and all of my books are about characters in urban areas, um, that's that's not a good mirror. Um, that's good windows, and that should be part of what I do, but it shouldn't be the only thing, in my opinion. I think sometimes that pendulum swings back and forth, and it goes too far in either direction, is what I think. You are free to disagree with that. I hope you found this interesting and thought provoking. If you have questions or comments, please reach out. Thanks for watching.